Today we're going to speak to fellow IBM champion Jack Woehr. We're going to talk about the IBM I and open source. So everyone, today I'm with Jack Woehr, and Jack is a specialist in IBM I. Jack, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Tracy. I've been in the programming racket for about 40 years. It ain't been all prime, but I've done my time. And from 1991 to 2011, I was a contributing editor for Dr. Dobbs' Journal, which was a very popular programmers magazine. And I'm badged by IBM as a Qiskit advocate. That is my hobby, aside from IBM I programming, has been working with IBM Q, the quantum computing that is coming along, and that's a fascinating field in itself. And this year I was named an IBM champion for contributions, open source contributions to IBM Q and to IBM I.
That would be an interesting topic unto itself, just talking about the quantum computing efforts. It's really fascinating.
Absolutely. IBM is really on the forefront there. I have great hopes for that project.
So Jack, exactly what is IBM I for the listeners that don't know about it?
Well, that's kind of a funny story. Like IBM, you can't separate the technology from the marketing. By the 1970s, mainframes were everywhere, but they were rather expensive for some enterprises. So IBM started underneath in the slipstream of the mainframes, making various platforms that did business databasing for smaller enterprises. And that went through, there was a system 1, a system 3, then you had a system 34 and a system 36 and a system 38, and then came the AS400 in 1988. And AS400 was a physical architecture. It was a 48-bit processor, and an operating system was written for it. It was very, very advanced for its time. There was inside IBM, there was a bit of a war between IBM Rochester, Minnesota, and corporate headquarters at Armonk. And Dr. Frank Soltis, who designed the system, later wrote a book about it called Fortress Rochester, how they held off IBM and kept them from, destroying their beautiful dream. And they built this wonderful system for business databasing. It's a database in a box, so to speak. It remains today one of the most advanced databasing systems you could dream of. And it's like the mainframes nowadays, this legacy system, and it is legacy, because the applications on it, some of them were ported directly from the mainframe from the 1970s code. I deal with applications like that all the time. It's got the legacy side, and then it's got the modern Unix side to it that you can you can log in via SSH. You can use very familiar Unix shells, Unix shell commands, and open source software. You got GCC, open source software. There's a package manager you can download, excuse me, and install packages with a simple command. Yum is the package manager, which everyone who has dealt with Linux knows. So it's got a very Linux-like face, so it's really more like AIX than Linux. And there's been a lot of work. I've helped port many of the packages that are there on the system now. And it's so these legacy systems, IBM Z OS and IBM I, which is what the AS400 became. The AS400, eventually the architecture was unified, and they all became running on the processor they used to call the RS6000. In other words, the power chip, just as the mainframes run on power chips now. The IBM I runs on the IBM Power systems. They're up to Power 9, Power 10 right now. They just released the Power 10 this fall. And IBM I is a virtualized operating system that runs on Power. It's no longer a separate hardware architecture. Everyone I know in the industry still calls it AS400, and it drives the people in Rochester crazy. No, it's IBM I. You mean I series? No, that's what we called it when we changed the architecture the first time to the power chips, and that was called I series. But it's IBM I now. What, you mean AS400? No, forget it. It's just this endless war over terminology. But it's a insurance companies run on it, car companies run on it. It's just a great databasing system. Everything, it's an object-oriented database system. It's almost like the folks at Rochester were laughing at the mainframers and saying, "This is what COS always should have been. This is the way it should have been done." so, so it's a wonderful system to work with. It's you develop you. I typically in mod, it's a green screen system with a very, very advanced character mode interface. So you can sit there and, the commands they prompt you for every field. It's just really easy to use at that level. If you're familiar with command line interfaces, it's fabulously easy and well documented, and very confusing in many ways. It's a legacy system, and so the concerns that are there are not concerns that are often shared by people who typically use their machine, their desktop workstation to browse the internet and get email. There's a lot about management of files and stuff like that. And then you can also log in via SSH. As I said, I can mount the disks on my local, I'm talking to you from a Mac Pro. I can mount the IBM I disks via SSH, mount them as local directories on my workstation. I can edit code. I can do compile commands from there. There's and several IDEs for doing remote development on the things. A very, very sophisticated and modern system supporting both legacy code and all the modern stuff that you expect, including, you can run X Windows applications on the IBM I. It's not practical most of the time, but you can. So effectively, it has a GUI and everything. It's just an amazing system.
So, boy, some of those terms you brought back to System 34, 36, 38, and the famous SEU, the source entry utility. Back in my days of programming RPG, I certainly remember a lot of those things. It's been a while.
Still programming RPG, Tracy. You know what I mean? It's the bane of my life, but there it is. I mean, I'm dealing with RPG3 applications still. I was supporting an like a DOS box on Windows. The AS400 I series IBM I supports System 36 applications in a artificial environment, in a DOS box, so to speak. And until April of this year, I was still supporting an RPG2 application written under System 36 in 1984, still running, that was running the entire business of a multi-billion-dollar insurance company. So,
when I was working with RPG2, I was at a small college, and we had to use Margie to send off to a university for compilation and testing. And we actually didn't have direct access. We did RPG programming on punch cards. If you can imagine the nightmare, though, one indicator off and it's all trash. And it was a horrible, horrible thing. Those, what is the IBM 25s, the punch card machines, and it was a nightmare to do RPG. Once I got to SEU, I was in heaven because it was a whole different world.
Imagine that, interactive terminals. What a concept.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Boy, life has changed a lot. We've both been in this business a while. It's changed a heck of a lot, hasn't it?
It certainly has, and it's changed in the direction of user empowerment, which is, of course, the attraction of open source itself.
So speaking of open source and IBM I, tell me a little bit about that. I know that you're an advocate with open source on the IBM I.
That's true, and it was really, I seem to have gotten into everything backwards in my career. I started working with Windows NT when it was still in beta, and I switched to OS2. Then I got into mainframes. I didn't start with mainframes. I got into mainframes around then, and then I stumbled into IBM I in kind of conjunction with mainframes, and they were starting up at that time. They had a thing called the the toolbox, the toolbox, and they open sourced it. They called it JT Open, and JT for Java Toolbox Open. And what it was and what it is today is a Java library that allows you to perform actions remotely on the IBM I. In the early history of the AS400, very quickly, people wanted to do applications called Gupta and Power Builder that allowed you to design interfaces and programs, and their interface, their GUI interface would run on a local workstation written in C, and it would talk to some TCP/IP servers that were running on the AS400. These were, listener threads like any remote service, but they were specially designed to facilitate writing user interfaces to do various actions on the IBM I and display the take the commands from the user's local workstation and display the output in various ways and provide GUI tools and stuff like that. And these were all written in C. And then some bright folks got the idea at IBM, well, let's write a Java library that talks to this and not actually write huge interfaces for people. Just write the Java library, give them this, and let 1,000 flowers bloom. See what happens. And they open sourced it. And around then, I stumbled into the IBM I. Said, "Oh, an open source Java library. Well, whatever this, I don't know what the AS400 does, but whatever it does, I'm going to play with it because it's got a Java library that allows, because it's like a mainframe, and I like mainframes, but it allows me to control it from my workstation. I can run a program on my workstation. It's actually reaching out and doing things to the IBM I. This is fun. I will learn this." So I sat down and I learned RPG, and I learned how to do C programming and how to do Rex. Rex is there on the IBM I, oddly enough. Nobody uses it, but it's there. I think I may be the only person who ever used it. Then I started programming. Once I figured out what the machine could do, a record-based system, EBCDIC. Oh, kind of weird, at all that. Once I got around that, I started doing JT Open program and contributing to the project. And some of my contributions are still there in the repository on SourceForge. And that led to a practice in IBM I because, old guy that I am, I'm one of the young guys in the IBM I field. It's like a lot of the guys who wrote the code retired or worse. And guys and gals who wrote the code are gone. And, people who understand this stuff, there's plenty of work. But open source makes my life easier. And the people at Rochester saw that, and they worked very, very hard. Certain people, like Kevin Adler, Jesse Gorzinski, and many, many others, not to leave off names and stuff, but worked very, very hard and pushed very, very hard at management, saying, we've got to make it easy for people to use open source because it's the only way to accomplish certain tasks. I went through this recently with a customer of mine where they were trying to do a simple data interchange with an EDI, electronic data interchange, with a vendor. They had to provide a file in a certain format, and they had to push it through a REST interface. The vendor had a REST interface, and you had to make an HTTP put to it, with a file. And it was very simple transaction. And there's a kit in IBM that will generate stub code for doing this in stub RPG code. And they were RPG programmers. They were classic AS400 programmers, still on the system in their late 60s. And they were trying to deal with this. And they were trying to figure out, they didn't understand REST interfaces. They didn't understand the web very well. They'd never dealt with this. And they had this kit, and they followed the instructions. And then they tried to modify the code, and they got really the shoelaces very, very tightly tied together. And I went in there and I said, okay, well, this is what you have to do in this 350 lines of RPG code, 350 lines of free RPG. It wasn't like columnar RPG. It actually, even in free, it was about 350 lines of code. And I said, and here it is, and here it works now, and you can use this, but here's 19 lines of Python that do the same thing. Would you like to learn Python? Well, how do we get the file? Well, you just you use ODBC and you grab the file. Well, how do we make a CSV of it? Well, use the CSV module in Python and you convert it to a CSV. Well, yeah, so the open source stuff, I mean, there's stuff, RPG is non-replaceable. It is absolutely part of IBM I programming. It's because it really simply is the most efficient way to utilize the resources of the machine. The machine, the interaction between the growth of the operating system and the development of the RPG compiler as it evolved over the decades, totally intertwined. There's no more efficient way to write an application than to use, you know, your nightly turns. You have to maintain, you can't rewrite those things. No, they've forgotten the business rules. The business rules are embedded in the code. They were embedded there 35 years ago and nobody remembers every little detail. You'd have to reverse engineer all these things. The documentation practices in the 1980s were not what they are in the 2010s and 2020s. So you have to keep these things running. You have to maintain these RPG programs. And anyway, it's really the most executionally CPU efficient way to program it. But for the specialty stuff where once a day, you know, you do a REST interface or something like that, or there's a really complex kind of operation you want to do on the system, some crazy thing where some vendor came in and hooked you up to a bunch of Windows machines or AIX machines, and you have to go out and do things to them and come back, and which is how a lot of, you know, people who thought, for instance, they were going to get off the platform ended up in the kind of situation they ended up in, where they, you know, a vendor would come in and give them a partial solution, and then they not only have legacy IBM I code to maintain, they have legacy AIX and legacy Windows and legacy Linux code to maintain in these fabulous Rube Goldberg machines that the consultants would design for them. And so you have to deal with something like that. I just ripped a whole bunch of, you know, Windows stuff out of the nightly close process for one of the things by writing some Python stuff. They had been using run remote command to the Windows machine, and then the remote command that ran on the Windows machine talked to the AIX machine, and it hopped from machine to machine. I said, nah, I just write some Python code that directly used SSH and SCP to deal with the remote machines. And everything was fine. It took me, you know, a couple of days to replace code that they paid God knows how much to the vendors to write at one time or another. So open source is absolutely indispensable in the IBM I world at this point. There's not a lot of new applications being written by vendors for the IBM I. And if you want to keep up with what's going on, you have to use Python, Ruby, Node.js, you know, GCC, Bash shell. The list goes on and on. This stuff is just, it's part of the practice of the internet. It's how the internet works. If your machine has to do any kind of interactions on the internet, you have to use the open source stuff. It's just too dicey. I mean, you can do it in RPG and people do it, but the problems they run into in understanding this and hooking together the logic. And, you know, when I need to solve a problem in Python, I just Google it. I say, Python, get the day for a date in, you know, in 10,000 BC. And somebody has asked that question on stackoverflow.com, and there's the answer right in front of me. You say, how do I do this in RPG? What's my syntax mistake? Where am I going wrong? Good luck. You get on the mailing list and you wait for someone who's done it before to answer you. You know, a certain amount of stuff you have to use the open source.
It's been a long time since RPG came out, before the mighty Google existed, right? And,
Absolutely.
and you know, talking about this system like 34, 36, 38 again in documentation reminds me of, boy, it's bringing flashbacks of these volumes of these hard plastic binder manuals around these things. It's all different now. Nobody would hardly ever print that stuff now. It's all PDFs. That wasn't an option in the day.
Oh yeah, IBM always was the greatest documenter in the world. They invented SGML, which became XML, and HTML for that matter.
Yep.
IBM invented all that technology. There used to be rooms of people, mostly women, who would be editing in SGML at IBM. I've seen the rooms, you know, and they'd sit there and they'd be making the tags and typing them in by hand and into a predecessor of what later became Ventura Publisher, which you know, dealt in SGML and stuff like that, and that all became that's where XML came from. So so it was there because IBM early on understood the value of abstract documents. And that's what we got into in the world of XML and HTML, was the world of abstract documents.
Well, something you've kind of already touched on, I guess, in a way, is around the value proposition of open source, because it sounds like it's a great connectivity tool and all. Um, what is the value for somebody to delve into that technology a lot more? You know, what kind of use cases are we going to solve?
At this point, to be honest, when I write, I mostly program IBM I, but if you know anything about me, get drawn into system administration. I eventually, ended up being a very serious system administrator for IBM I. And there's a lot of system administration tasks that are a lot easier to do in Python and ODBC than are to do in CL. CL it's not the world's worst designed programming language, but it's very close to it. CL is an abomination. It should never have existed. But I hope you don't mind me being frank here.
It's fine.
But the things you get into, the struggles you get into, it's so wordy and it's so clumsy to use. CL I use again, as on ZOS with Unix system services, on IBM I plus PACE, the portable application support environment, whatever PACE stands for, which really means the AIXC library ported to IBM I is what it really is, mostly. In this environment that runs the open source, again, the two sides talk to each other. You can cause things to happen in the Unix side from CL. You can cause CLs to run from the Unix side. They're totally integrated, and they're integrated very lovely. And where they aren't, we patch around it, writing our own code. And Unix commands don't typically return multiple variables that could be instantiated into CL variables. For instance, we have to kind of do that by hand. But basically, CL has become, for me, mostly a language for launching Python scripts on the other side, doing everything in Python, because anything I want to do beyond, say, delete a file is easier to do in Python than it is to do in CL. Anytime I want to figure out date arithmetic, anytime I want to get rows out of a database and do some calculation on them, I could write a CL in an RPG program, or I can write a CL in a Python program. The Python program is this long, and the RPG program is this long. Right. It's like RPG is RPG is pre-SQL. RPG is the assembly code that SQL is written in. Basically, it's database assembly code. And so when you write an application RPG, it's like writing an assembly code as opposed to a high-level language.
Input, calculate, output.
Yeah, right. Well, that's the old loop. Now you don't have to do it that way. It's a procedural language now, which just makes everything all the more confusing. RPG is a language only RPG programmers can love. So,
well, there's something to be said for that. Sounds like a niche market almost.
It is. It definitely is. No, I mean, I don't mean to run down RPG. RPG is an amazing, very amazing language, and what is being done with it today is even more amazing. It's really a full modern language at this point, the free language. But that's not what's happening on my block. I'm maintaining our legacy RPG 3 code.
So what, anything else you want to add about the IBM I or open source?
Yeah, everybody who wants to get involved with open source on the IBM I, really there's a forum called River, RYVER, and there's an IBM I OSS thing there, and there's a short link, IBM. Let's see, IBM. There's an IBM.biz short link to the self-enrollment link for that. You can find that around the web if you look up IBM I open source. There's a bunch of wikis that tell you what the self-enrollment link is for that. You should get on that. You should get on the midrange.com lists and talk to people there. There's a lot of people who are very, very experienced at this now and are really out there willing to help you. If you are the classic RPG programmer, you realize I have to start dealing with open source. I just can't do everything that management wants me to do with the tools I've been using for the last 30 years. It's time to visit the open source world, which is totally, the open source world is the world that the net runs on. So if you're having trouble with internet programming, go to the source, take it from the horse's mouth, go to open source, which is what it all runs on. All your websites, Google, everybody, all these companies, they're running on open source. That's what the whole world's doing now, because for the same reason IBM got enthused with it many years ago, which is they discovered that they could get people to do work for them for free. The internet was built largely for free by at least the software, by the people who were dedicated to the open source movement. I was one of them, and people know Richard Stallman, Theodorat, and all these Eric Allman, and all these heroes of the open source world. So
open source was something I think, that started coming around, and a lot of companies kind of fought against. They all wanted everything proprietary and all, but the world doesn't work that way now. And open source has really changed, I think, a lot of things in our industry.
Yeah, Richard Stallman is a personal friend of mine, the guy who founded the GNU Free Software Foundation. And he's come under a lot of criticism for some rather indiscreet personal opinions that he offered on the net. And he got, booted to a large extent from his sinecure. But he will be remembered, and he hates it when I say this. He scolds me when I say this. But really, what, aside from designing, writing Emacs in the GCC compiler, which he did himself, the original versions of them, the thing that he will be remembered for is that the GNU Manifesto, in which he said that you don't have to sell software for it to be economically viable. You can give away the software and sell support. And that was the face that launched hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars worth of business in the world. That, what was it? Who was it who bought MySQL? It wasn't Microsoft. Maybe it was Oracle bought MySQL. Somebody bought MySQL for 550. Was it 500 for billions of dollars? It was just an incredible amount of money. Half a billion, maybe it was $550 million or something like that. Just the amount of commerce that takes place based on the open source model. You can have the software. We will sell you special tools that work with the software, and we will sell you support. Red Hat, Ubuntu. These are distros, but all the databases, all the modern open source databases, that the message buses, Kafka, the enterprise message protocol designed by publish subscribe model created by LinkedIn. These are immense and have universal acceptance in certain industries, and they're all based on the same economic model. It was Richard Stallman who said, there was open source before Richard Stallman. It was him who said, clearly there's an economic place for this in the world's economy, and he was right.
Yeah, it's about understanding tools, and a lot of the industry people that I work with, and where I am in the industry, a lot of it's about domain knowledge. There's a lot of different tools to solve the same problem, but understanding how to take a good tool and use it properly, use it efficiently, is very valuable information and very valuable knowledge, more so than the software itself in some cases.
Yes, well, I talk to young people who are getting into programming, and I have the same conversation over and over again. And one version of it goes this way. This fellow asked me for some mentoring, and we have a mentoring space on this Slack channel, this Slack group that we do. And I went into the channel with him and I said, "What's your problem?" He says, "I wasted my life. I spent 7 years in the oil and gas industry, and I'm just now at 29 getting into programming." I said, "You're crazy." I said, I've done oil and gas programming, and the whole problem in that industry is finding someone that these guys can talk to who know what the oil and gas business is. If you have minimal programming skills, you will be able to find employment in the oil and gas industry, because they're looking for people that they don't have to explain oil and gas to. Domain expertise always trumps specific technical knowledge. Anyone can acquire technical knowledge. It's all over the web. Wisdom crieth in the streets, as the Bible says. It's all out there. What people need is people who understand the mission and the customer.
That's right. Well, Jack, I really appreciate your time. It was a very interesting and educational discussion, and maybe we'll have to have that conversation about quantum computing in the near future.
I'd love that. Thank you very much, Tracy.